Artificial intelligence and data centers are reshaping the U.S. energy system and driving electricity demand higher. At the same time, Americans are feeling the pressure of rising energy bills, and concerns about reliability and affordability are forcing policymakers to ask some hard questions. How do we build the next generation of power infrastructure? Who builds it? And who bears the financial risk if we get it wrong? Those questions are front and center for state utility regulators across the country, especially as utilities seek approval for more infrastructure investments. Customers still expect reliable and affordable power, even as the system faces new pressures from AI, electrification, extreme weather, and load growth. You're listening to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we unpack the stories, policy debates, and trends behind America's power grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, President and CEO of EPSA. Today, I'm joined by Ann Rendahl, President of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, or NARUC, and a commissioner at the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. Ann helps lead state regulators nationwide while continuing to oversee rate cases and infrastructure decisions in her own state. We recorded this episode just 1 week before NARUC's annual winter meeting taking place February 8th through 11th, where utility commissioners from every U.S. state will gather in D.C. to discuss the top issues shaping the utility sector. Ann is also a featured speaker at our upcoming Competitive Power Summit in Washington on March 3rd. Visit epsa.org to register to hear from her and a lineup of nearly 20 speakers. In this episode, we talk about how regulators are balancing reliability and affordability, the tools they use to decide which investments are truly needed, where cost pressures are emerging, and how collaboration between industry and regulators, alongside competitive markets and private investment, can help deliver the reliable infrastructure needed without shifting unnecessary risk onto consumers. Here's Ann. Ann, thank you very much for taking time to be with us. I know we've been kind of juggling schedules to get you in here. You're very busy wearing a lot of hats these days, so we're going to talk about all of those. But I wanted to welcome you and thank you for joining us. And as you know, we were talking before we started, you're wearing two important hats right now. You're the NARUC president this year, which is a big job, but you're also still a commissioner at the Washington UTC, which means you've got your day job and your extra job. So I know you're juggling a lot of things, but as you kick off 2026, what are some of the top issues that you're working on in either or both of those roles? I know there's certainly overlap, but Washington has its own set of issues, and now you're also working to represent all 50 states in the U.S. territories. So tell us what you're working on.
Well, I think overall and consistent with the rest of the country, it's affordability and reliability. You know, the storm that's just gone across the country is really showing the importance of making sure that we have the grid up and running to support people. And for affordability, this is an issue with almost every filing by a regulated entity here in Washington. And that would include electricity, gas, water, and solid waste, all of which we regulate here in Washington for rates. And I know it's a top issue facing my colleagues across the country. But as costs increase for utilities to provide reliable service to customers and ensure reliable service, they need to recover these costs and rates. So that's really the issue. And we have quite a few cases now pending before the commission. We have Avista who filed their multi-year rate plan and PSE that's about to file their multi-year rate plan and a rate case with Northwest Natural Gas. We also regulate marine pilots here in Washington. So we have a rate case with marine pilots and a few other fun dockets. So it's busy on both fronts right now.
And is that an uptick in the number of rate cases that you would have, or is that fairly consistent with what you see, or are you seeing the trend because of the issues that we're experiencing that you're just seeing more cases? I'm not familiar enough with Washington's process to know if that's a normal year or if this is a busy year.
So unfortunately, both major companies are filing rate cases at the same time.
Year. Yeah.
And the same year, but we have a fairly busy calendar all the time. We are usually juggling several cases at once. So
I'm looking for that first commissioner that says they've got, a lot of free time and they're sitting at their desk waiting for the work to come in. They're all doing more than I think maybe some expected when they joined the bench, but here they are.
Yeah, I've been doing this. This is my 12th year. I think it has gotten busier, but I've never had downtime. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it's not the nature of the beast these days.
Nope.
So as you talked about two very important issues, I mean, clearly reliability and affordability are kind of 1A and 1B. Are there common themes that you're seeing across the country in states that are showing up in Washington, or are there important regional differences to account for? I think people would expect you to say, and you may, well, there's markets and then there's vertically integrated. There's the Northwest because it's a different fuel mix than you might have in the Southeast, or Texas is just Texas. So how are you thinking about that? And what are you hearing from your peers as you kind of take on the overarching role as the NARUC president this year as well?
Thanks. Yeah, there are differences between states, between regions, and you've identified a few of those. I think the markets, the organized market versus the non-RTO states, particularly the Northwest and the Southeast,
Right.
it creates differences. We are not as engaged. But in the West, we have, these burgeoning and emerging day-ahead markets
Yeah.
with CAISO and Southwest Power Pool both putting forward their model and developing those. And that's been quite a education for many of the folks in the West. And different regions have different policies. They also have different
Sure.
dominant resources. Obviously, the Northwest has a lot of hydro. But in Washington, we're a little different in that about over half of the customers in the state are served by consumer and utilities, and we don't regulate in those in Washington state. So the non-consumer and utilities, the investor and utilities in the Northwest have some hydro, but not to the extent that the consumer and utilities do. We also have policies for clean energy, and the utilities are needing to meet those, both the Clean Energy Transformation Act and also our Climate Commitment Act, which is our cap and trade. So there's kind of a pricing impact as well as the policies. And I would say the other issues that states are dealing with are the different extreme weather impacts. Obviously, here in Washington and the North and the West, we've been experiencing more wildfires, more risk of wildfires, but we've also had severe wind and storms. And then there's other areas that have hurricanes or tornadoes. But I think everyone is experiencing more of what they experience. So more severe weather, and the wildfire risk is spreading.
Yeah. I've said it before, and at the risk of repeating it too often, I'll say it once more, that it's kind of the everything everywhere all at once. I mean, that does kind of feel like the world that we're operating in these days. And so that makes the job all the more difficult for you as a regulator to try and navigate through all these. And you've described your presidency at NARUC as about uniting regulators. So trying to advance reliable and resilient infrastructure and all the positive outcomes that come from that. Can you talk a little bit about how you envision that playing out and how you kind of came up with the theme for the year? I know these are persistent themes, right? There are different flavors maybe, but everyone wants to assure these things happen. So how are you thinking about it? And I know your colleagues that are in the leadership at NARUC are thinking about it similarly. So I'd love to hear kind of how you came up with this with your colleagues.
Thanks for asking about that. So it's actually a 3-year theme. It's not just this year.
Right.
It's uniting regulators, harmonizing impact. And that is a theme that First Vice President Judge Hudson from Virginia and Second Vice President Chair Sieben from Minnesota and I talked about through the year about whether we should have a continuing theme or each have our own theme. And we landed on uniting regulators and harmonizing impact because we want to focus on how NARUC can support the commissioners and staff and how we can work collaboratively and in partnership with each other, because that's really the benefit of NARUC, of being able to get together, share information, share what we know. And in this case, it's really when we're all working together, we can have a better impact nationally and in our respective states if we're all getting sort of the best of what we're doing. And it doesn't mean we're uniform, because there's no way, 50 states plus DC plus Puerto Rico, Guam and Virgin Islands can all agree on the same thing, but we can all benefit from being together. And so my sub-theme, though, is on advancing reliable and resilient infrastructure. And that's really about, it doesn't matter what state or region that you're in, we're all facing the need to build and to maintain utility infrastructure. And that's for electric and gas communications and water to serve the increasing customer demand. And it's not just data centers. Some regions are experiencing more just due to growth, due to electrification, or due to onshoring manufacturing. And so this growth is coming from a lot of reasons, not just data centers. But we need to address this, get things built, and get things done affordably. and make sure they're reliable and resilient. Because the other issue, and I mentioned it just a few minutes ago, is that this extreme weather is straining the grid. It's not just the demand. And so we need to make sure that the infrastructure we're building and the infrastructure that's currently in place can withstand these stresses that are coming.
Yeah. As folks who are on the eastern portion of the country who are still going through the remnants of Winter Storm Fern, this cold weather snap, I mean, we're experiencing the exact issue that you referenced. Those resources have got to be available and they've got to deliver. And it's interesting, if you've been to NARUC the last handful of years, there's some new stakeholders that are at NARUC, and they've kind of joined what we would call maybe the legacy participants that are regulars. How are you trying to work incorporating the new and the old together? Because it's a different culture. It's a different group of people that have different perspectives. I think it's really interesting to watch, but how are you thinking about stitching these two groups together to get good outcomes?
So I think if you mean by new, I think you're including the sort of hyperscaler and data center interests, and maybe also the technology companies that are focused on reliability and resilience. I'm
Exactly right.
Particularly wildfire. There's a lot of tech startups that are focused on how utilities can provide these critical services to communities and maintain the reliability and get ahead of some of these risks. So I think that nexus really is the critical utility services that NARUC members regulate. It's the electricity, gas, water, and communications.
Yeah.
And for data centers, they need the services that utilities provide. And as we know from the administration and others, we need to get this quickly. We need to get these folks connected quickly, but fairly and affordably. And the technology companies are focusing on these risks that we're experiencing and how to provide the utility services more quickly. While I've been dealing with wildfire, when I was first vice president, that was my focus. And we've just finished completing this wildfire workbook. I'm going to have a workshop on Sunday at the Winter NARUC meeting. And a lot of the technologies, they're changing so quickly, but they're providing some really excellent strategies. And with the data centers, states are all trying to figure out what's the best way of connecting these data centers. And so one way of sharing these best practices has been through the demand roundtable that's happened the last year or so. And now this year, we're focusing on it through a joint electricity committee and ERE committee meeting, sharing states and hyperscaler kind of best practices for tariffs and how to protect customers and get folks connected quickly.
You've hit on really all the critical issues about how we're going to try and get from here to success in including them. And I like the way you kind of described, these are folks who should be in the discussion and at the table. They're driving some of the solutions. They're increasing some of the load. They're certainly going to be a critical part going forward. And I think you've already kind of given us a peek about what you hope to see out of the NARUC meeting, but the summit starts this weekend as we're recording and will be the better part of the second week here in Washington, D.C. What are you hoping for attendees to get out of it? I know the focus, you may want to expand on the focus a little bit, but are there things we should be watching for or things that you think these are kind of the tangible takeaways that I hope people will get from coming to the meeting?
So, as you know, from NARUC meetings, there is a full schedule. And
Indeed.
there'll be a lot of people there. We have about 1,900 folks registered for the meeting. So it will be, It's exciting. A lot of folks are going to be there. And so plenty of opportunities to talk to folks. But we're going to, as I said, we're going to kick off the day with a workshop on Sunday, because we love to start on Sunday.
Right.
Much to everybody's dismay. But we're starting with a workshop on utility wildfire risks and how state commissions and consumer advocates and energy offices can address them. So it'll be highlighting this workbook that has just been published on NARUC's website and talk with utilities and tech companies and others on what else we need to do to support states with this risk that is spreading across the country. Right. So that's Sunday. There'll be another workshop on electric vehicles in the afternoon, and the various staff subcommittees have their sessions and other committees. But the general sessions, Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, are going to focus on these challenges to utility infrastructure and reliability and resilience. So we'll hear from Alex Fitzsimmons, who's the director of the CSER office, which is the cybersecurity, energy security, and emergency response office at DOE, and then a panel on cybersecurity, including Jim Robb from NERC.
Yep.
So that's Monday morning. And then Tuesday, we'll have a permitting panel. So we'll be having some conversation with Jamal Hudson. Judge Hudson will be kicking that off, and we'll be having we hope, some congressional representatives, including Senator Fisher from Nebraska, talking about permitting issues. We have Tuesday afternoon, I'll be kicking that general session off with a fireside chat with FERC Chairman Sweat. And then we'll have a panel talking about how the different utility sectors are working together when there are challenges, when there are resilience issues like wildfires and storms, how we do that. And then Wednesday, we'll round it off with a affordability panel, and we'll be hearing from Senator King from Maine as well on that. And then there's all the various committees. And during the committee panel, I mentioned the one with the joint session to talk about interconnecting large load. And Nick Elliott, Senior Policy Advisor for the National Energy Dominance Council, is going to kick off that panel. So lots going on. And then we end on Wednesday with the Federal State Current Issues Collaborative, where the FERC commissioners and 10 state commissioners from the 5 NARUC regions are going to talk about affordability and the intersection with demand from large loads. So that's a full meeting. Lots going on.
Yeah, and then some. And then you can go home and try and catch your breath, because it's a sprint and a marathon. So, and you unfortunately bear the brunt of it as the leader of this fine organization this year. You'll be front and center from start to finish. So we will do our level best to make sure you have the opportunity to catch your breath. So as we've talked about all those issues, let's dial it back and be more specific about what some of the states are dealing in. As state commissioners are seeing more and more infrastructure investment proposals. I mean, as you noted, clearly there is a need for it in virtually all parts of the country. I don't know if it's unprecedented. Maybe you can give us some perspective as you've seen it over your career doing regulatory work. But how are regulators balancing this need between reliability and resilience with the growing concern about affordability? I mean, the system isn't free. We often say that. Reliability does come with a cost, but the system, if no one can afford to pay for it, is not meeting the objectives that as a society we want to get to. So how are you thinking about that, both maybe individually or in Washington, but also if you want to broaden it? I'm, of course, always curious to see what you're hearing from your peers.
Well, I think we're all experiencing the same issues, maybe in different ways, whether it's from data centers or just the need to build capacity and the need to build transmission and pipes and wires. So I'd say balance is a word that regulators use a lot. And usually we use that in the context of balancing customers and the companies in terms of setting, in Washington statutes, it's fair, just, reasonable, and sufficient rates, which we've interpreted in Washington as fair, just, and reasonable for customers and sufficient for the utilities to recover their costs of providing service and an opportunity to earn a fair return on those investments. But this is unprecedented times. I think there's both increased costs across the board. And so customers are experiencing increased costs, so are the utilities. So the cost of fuels, the cost of materials, and increased costs from damage to extreme weather. So this storm that's just gone through the north, through the south and the east, that's going to increase the costs to provide service to customers, because you have to replace the poles, you have to replace the wires.
Storm damage recovery riders.
Storm damage recovery riders. And then invariably, the cost of gas increases during these kind of events. So that fuel cost is a pass-through, and explaining that to customers is not easy. And then there's the need to build capacity and build transmission and upgrade the distribution system to manage both the new load coming on, but also customer installed generation, and to make it all work. So costs aren't going down. And so balance is a hard word right now. I think it's really hard to figure out in some ways that, yes, the utility spent this because they needed to, but how much can we spend all at once? And that's an issue. We're seeing it in water. We're seeing it in electricity, not so much in gas. And in the Northwest, we're not seeing as much gas pipeline build out. The question is how to make sure rates are structured so to not overburden customers.
Exactly.
But ensure the utilities are planning appropriate investments to serve the customers, not more and not less. It's needed.
It's Goldilocks, right? Just right.
But not all at once. And I don't think we're in a Goldilocks moment right now, unfortunately. And so managing this growth In some cases, it might mitigate that increased cost to serve customers if you have core customer growth. But where we have demand, large data centers, it's making sure that we're not shifting those costs.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different issues going on. But yes, we hear from customers even more than we used to. And it's not
Yeah.
easy. It's not easy.
That's right. You do not have the easiest job by a long shot. So as you're thinking about all that, I mean, and I like how you have not just talked about electricity, but it's the multiple utility services that consumers utilize, all of whom have expenses and things that have to be incorporated into the rate cases that they file. How do you think about it, or how do regulators generally thinking about when's an investment truly needed versus when does the cost benefit not pencil as you look at a filing that may come before you, or as you think about, a generic proceeding that might exist so as to avoid any pending cases that I'm probably not even aware of. But how do you think about those issues to know, this is a reasonable approach that seems like a rational expense, and this is maybe a little more than what we needed. And so you've got to take regulatory actions that disallow or the various tools that are available to you, because that is the core of the reliability and affordability question. Is system's got to have what it needs, got to be able to pay for it, be smart about how you do those things. How do you think about that from a regulatory perspective?
So we have tools as regulators, and I'll speak to Washington, but I think many of these tools go across states.
Sure.
But states do rate cases differently. They might have future test years or historic test years, or Washington, we're more sort of a hybrid historic test year state. We apply our prudence test, which is based on, is there a need for this investment?
Yep.
Is it a reasonable decision based on the facts at the time? And if it's a significant expense, we want to make sure we have the board of directors reviewing this. There's cost benefit analysis of this. We want to make sure they're demonstrating through contemporaneous documents how they made this decision, because we don't do a hindsight review. We're looking at the time they made the decision, was it rational? And then they need to have a continued review of this decision, particularly if it's a big project. Is it still a good idea to go forward? And on top of that, is this investment used and useful for customers?
Right.
Or is it for customer use? And so then there's all the cost allocation between different customer segments.
Yep.
Who is creating the cost? Who needs to bear the burden? There's some newer tools that some states are using, like performance-based regulation and performance measures. We're starting to use those measures. We have a docket open we're working on. We've got some metrics that we've identified. We haven't developed any performance metrics that we're using for incentives. And so that that's the core rate making principles, and every state's going to apply them slightly differently. But we also have to think about rate shock. And we've seen this most recently in water rate cases, where small utilities are purchased by larger utilities, and they have the ability to invest capital, but sometimes it can be too much for customers to bear. So then we have to say, well, what's reasonable? Sorry, you maybe were not prudent in thinking about how much you could try to invest all at one time and try to recover from customers. So those are some of the tools that we use and the ways we think about it.
Do you think you're seeing the regulatory community kind of focus more, or maybe it always has, but is trying to move it to the front of the thinking about tying reliability or tying investment dollars to specific outcomes? So reliability performance or resilience, or, obviously there's got to be a customer value or you're not going to approve to begin with. But so it's kind of the trust but verify. And then, consumers can feel comfortable that, I may not love this expense, but I know that it's been pressure tested and it was justified. And so I might grit my teeth, but it was a good investment that was needed for the system. Are you explicitly tying those things, or are we not quite there yet? And I know there's a variety of approaches, I'm sure, but how do you think about that?
So we are not quite there yet in Washington, but I would say we're starting to get there. We also have, through our multi-year rate plan and another statutory change a few years ago, that we can approve a utility request to include in rates for up to 4 years beyond the rate effective period. And then every year, our staff will evaluate, did the company actually do what they said they were going to do? Was it a prudence? So it's like an initial prudence and then a final prudence review, where we have the ability to order refunds to customers if the company didn't actually do what they said they were going to do, or it wasn't a reasonable investment.
Okay.
So that's something we're doing, but we're also looking at performance measures. And I
Mhm.
think in the area of wildfire expenses, because then some of those investments are in different buckets and those are in trackers. And every year there's a recovery. And
Yep.
so we're looking at what's called risk spend efficiency. So does the investment actually reduce the risk of wildfire, and by how much? And is it continuing to be a good idea to invest in this for wildfire mitigation, or is there some other technique that is better for
Mhm.
reducing risk? So that's another way of thinking about it. Oregon and California apply that model.
Okay. Interesting. And we do see, and I like the way you described it initially, there's a variety of approaches. And, I sort of tongue in cheek say you can be a good example or you could be a cautionary tale. So if states are doing it well, then those are things that other states ought to be looking at replicating. And if a state maybe misses the mark, then people can say, okay, that's one of the 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb. So we won't do that. But I think that's a helpful way and for those that have never or don't attend or aren't familiar with NARUC, I think that's one of the greatest value propositions that come from attending is you get the opportunity to talk to your peers about how are you handling some of these issues and get some real-time feedback and ideas that this is working or, we thought that would work and it's just not. So maybe refocus your attention somewhere else. I think that's incredibly thoughtful. And because we're dealing with so much happening at once, as you just described, are you all thinking as much about new ways or different approaches towards cost allocation or cost responsibility? I'm not sure what label you might want to put on it, but for new types of load and infrastructure, because yes, data centers and all the cost causation principles that good regulators follow, but are you thinking about it in a different approach because it's all the utilities, it's all the investments, it's all happening at the same time? Are you thinking about that? Is that changing the way you've had to think about it in the past, or is it like it's just more of the same? We're just having to deal with all of it at the same time.
I think we're applying some of those cost, the cost principles, the cost causation
Hmm.
principles. In Washington, the investor-owned utilities have not yet had significant requests from data centers. It's mostly been the consumer-owned utilities in the state on the Columbia River, but they have applied those types of principles. And we have legislation pending, and our governor had a data center working group to think about how to address some of these issues. So yes, it's, what are benefits that this large load can bring to communities, but how do we make sure we're not burdening the communities with the cost?
Right.
FERC is looking at these same issues,
Hmm.
and a lot of other states are, and we're going to be talking about it in NARUC. So I think much like the wildfire, where we're improving over time, we're learning what's successful and what's not. Similar to that with the large load issue,
Yeah.
trying to figure out what tariffs are working, what's not, how to make sure we can develop these tariffs to connect folks quickly if we can,
Hmm.
and what are the best techniques for doing that. And so that's what that joint panel with electricity and energy resources and the environment committees is focused on.
I have a sneaking suspicion that will be very well attended this
I
go
think
around.
so.
So,
I
yeah.
think so.
So, as you're thinking about the role of markets, as you know, of course, we're firm believers in markets, and you've had the experience of getting up to speed in this kind of organic, from the bottom up approach that's happening in the West, which I find fascinating because it's a different flavor, but trying to achieve very similar outcomes. From your perspective, how are you thinking about organized wholesale markets? Does it help manage cost? Does it help deliver reliability and infrastructure? As you're just getting the wheels turning in the West, are you seeing the directional benefits that are likely to come from this? And what's your perspective about how it's evolving in the West? Because most folks probably aren't paying attention to it, but you're up to your elbows in it. I know we've talked about it before. So I'm curious
Yeah.
kind of what your read is now here in February of 2026.
Well, I think there is a recognition both with state regulators and also all the various utilities, whether they're consumer owned or investor owned,
Hmm.
that having 38 balancing authorities in the West has not been the most efficient way
Yeah.
of doing business. Although in the West, we're independent. We like to do things the way we want to do things.
Hmm.
And so it's been an incremental process. CAISO and PacifiCorp started the energy imbalance market through CAISO back in 2015, and it
Right.
now serves over 80% of the load in the West. But CAISO is now developing what they call their extended day ahead market. So it's building on that incrementally to day ahead, but not full RTO.
Hmm.
Likewise, SPP developed an EIM, and now they call it an EIS. and they're developing their day-ahead market, which is called Markets Plus. So they're moving west and CAISO's moving east, and the two of them are competing actively for different utilities to join.
Sure.
And SPP has RTO West with some of the utilities,
Yeah.
mostly consumer-owned utilities. I think Excel may be joining in Colorado. And so I think the commissioners who haven't had to deal with markets
Mhm.
for all these years, unlike the folks in other regions, we're learning a lot. We're learning what it means to set up a market, and that includes gazillion meetings and detailed conversations. And so now we're on this path that I think that we understand that it's more efficient and there are benefits to be gained from working together and having a market where you can share if somebody has excess and somebody needs it. There's a benefit there.
Right.
Financially, we've seen it in the EIM and likely to see it in EDAM and Markets Plus. I think the issue there is going to be seams, and that is something we need to learn from the East, but also figure out how to apply it to the West.
Yeah, how to make it work in the West.
How to make it work, because I think one of the issues we do have is a number of the states have clean energy goals, or in the case of California, Washington, we have actual cap and trade and greenhouse gas pricing. So adding that into the mix is yet another fun thing. But we've been spending a lot of time on transmission planning and cost allocation, training up staff and coming up with ideas on how we might implement the state preference model under FERC's Order 1920 A and B, and I think there's even a C now, how that works. And so a lot of education through the Western Interstate Energy Board and their staff, and support the commissions, but we're making progress is what I would say.
It's not an easy process, and I'm very fascinated to watch because of the way it's evolving from the bottom up, not the top down. So we'll continue to watch with interest. So from your perch as a regulator, how are you looking at these competitive markets to ensure they're delivering value? I mean, obviously there's the economics that you mentioned, and I think early stages suggest that that's the case. Are you looking at reliability or emissions or anything else that's kind of on your scorecard or the state scorecard as you look at, participation is deriving these benefits for us?
So it's obviously you want the cost that the utilities are spending on joining and setting them up. You want ultimately, even though there's some high prices initially to join, you want to make sure that they're ultimately going to be providing benefit to customers.
Right.
And part of that is making sure there's an effective market monitor, that there's not going to be any inappropriate market power that's being applied in the market, that customers are getting their appropriate efficiencies from this, and that ultimately, if there can be some benefits for transmission planning, that we can have a role in cost allocation and exercising those muscles for how you evaluate cost allocation and transmission planning is really something I think new for Western states, but we're getting there. But it's making sure that the markets are operating appropriately. We've had experience from 25 years ago with the Western market issues and don't want a repeat of that. And we also see what's happening in other regions and don't want to replicate some of the things that don't seem to be working. So going cautiously and incrementally is really, I think, what states have been looking at.
So, Anne, as we're kind of approaching the end of our conversation around this, what do you think effective collaboration or effective interaction between regulators and industry looks like when I think everybody agrees the goal is a cost-effective, reliable grid?
There's talking about what we do at NARUC, where we share experiences, and that's with regulators and the industry. And I think then it's in conversations like what's happening in the Northwest. We get together with the Western Interstate Energy Board, has conferences twice a year. And those bring together regulators, energy office, the industry, to talk about issues with the electric grid in the West. And it's a very effective conversation. But I think, examples like that where you can come together and have conversations about what's working, what's not working. I know it's been difficult in the PJM region, but it sounds like there are a lot of conversations going on and focused on really trying to make sure that that market and that grid is working effectively. So I think you just have to have the commitment to have the hard conversations, raise issues that concern you, and expect to have honest conversation about what's not working and how to make it work better.
Yeah. Is there one mindset shift that you think would be helpful from both sides of the table, whether it's industry or regulators or both, as we're all working through this major set of challenges and opportunities that exist? Is there one behavior change or one perspective change that you think would say this would enable us to do what you just said, is have these hard conversations and get to a solution?
So I think about, as regulators, a lot of what we do is spend time in these cases, right? And so
Yeah.
we're litigating, and that's not always the best way to get to an outcome. And I think a mind shift maybe for that is for industry, and I'm thinking here are the companies that we regulate, to really show the value of what you're proposing to ask customers to pay for. And don't just give us the spreadsheets and the testimony with the
Right.
technical details, but make your case about why this is important for regulators to require customers to pay for it. And maybe having more technical conferences at commissions where we talk about these filings in a way to really get into the why and what's important without just the litigated model, which doesn't always get you to where you need to go. That's not where the conversations are going to happen. And so stepping back and seeing if there's common ground for where we need to go. And then if you need to, obviously you're going to litigate it. But I think
course.
more solutions come through settlements, but oftentimes if the commissions are not involved, we receive settlements, but then we have lots of questions.
Yeah.
And so having more of those conversations, I think is helpful.
Yeah. What's one thing about the way the system works or how decisions get made that you don't think the public maybe appreciates as much as they could, but it would help them if they did understand a little more about how the process works and how outcomes are achieved?
It's pretty hard, I think, for a customer to really understand. And we see that in public hearings all the time. They come in, they don't really understand sometimes what it is they're responding to.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could do a better job too, explaining the why. But I think understanding that there are statutes, at least in the regulated model, statutes that require the commissions, as I said earlier, we are required to set fair, just, reasonable
Right.
and sufficient rates. We are supposed to make sure that the utilities are able to recover their costs in a fair way. So what's fair and what's a fair share? I don't think the public also understands when there are issues like the storm that just came through. What's involved in the electric system?
Mm-hmm.
Not just flipping on the lights, but what's involved in getting it to the customers and the issues that can happen when you have these storms and the difference between electric and gas. I mean, you don't want the gas system to go down because if you do, that's a lot longer and more complicated because it's not just connecting the wires. You have to shut down the pipeline. You have to turn off people's pilot lights. You have to get the system back and running, and then you have to turn everybody
Relight
on.
them. Yeah.
Relight them. And so I think really basically understanding how the system works is helpful. But I think, as I said, we could do a better job explaining how we do what we do and the process. Because I think what we do is it's a lot of process.
Yes, it is. So we're looking to the future. If we're having this conversation a year from now and your presidency is behind you, what do you think will look different?
Well, I hope that we are beyond this issue about data centers and how to connect them, that we have models that work, and maybe Congress has addressed permitting in a way that we can act more quickly and build things, because that's what we really need to do is build. That's my hope.
Okay, now we'll see.
Now we'll see.
Okay, so we've talked about cost and reliability. What excites you the most about the future of the system and the role regulators can play in shaping it?
Well, it is so dynamic. And it is not just
It is
the
that.
generation along the wire to the customers. It's two ways. There's sensing, there's ways to make sure the system is more resilient. And regulators need to understand that, and they need to actually do what they do, which is ensure that companies are doing the appropriate things to make sure it's safe and reliable and also affordable.
So we've talked a lot about the scale of the challenge, which is tremendous. What gives you confidence that regulators and markets and industry, all the stakeholders can work together to deliver what the customer ultimately wants without losing sight of affordability? Or let me ask it maybe a shorter way. What makes you optimistic about our collective ability to meet the moment?
That we all care. We all really care. We have passion about this. We want it to work. We'd rather make it work than fight about it.
Yeah.
I think generally that is the bottom line. We all want to make it work. And so with that, I think there's desire and incentive and a goal to get there.
And I couldn't think of a better way for us to close the conversation than that optimistic note about how we can get there from here. So let me thank you again for taking time to be with us and talk about what you're doing in Washington, but also the great work you're doing at NARUC with your second job that probably takes almost as much time as your day job does. I know having to travel from Washington to all the places around the country is no easy task for you. So we certainly are grateful for your commitment and willingness to do it.
Well, thank you. This has been a pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Meeting America's growing electricity needs will take real projects, real investment, and a clear focus on keeping the grid reliable and affordable for consumers. As my conversation with Ann makes clear, while the demand for power is rising quickly, the real challenge for regulators is deciding how to respond, ensuring the investments being made are necessary, affordable, and fairly allocated for customers. And again, don't forget to register for the Competitive Power Summit on March 3rd to hear more from Ann and other national and state regulators, policymakers, and energy executives. At EPSA, we'll continue working to ensure policies support investment, competition, and reliability so the energy system can meet growing demand without losing sight of affordability. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about these issues on our website at epsa.org and follow us on social media at X on EPSA News and LinkedIn. The music for this podcast is produced by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time on Energy Solutions.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, bringing about 200,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.